The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Stanley Greenberg on the failing vision of the GOP, Ruy Teixeira on why Democrats need to build an even bigger tent, plus Bill Press on why psychiatrists are speaking out to say Trump is unfit to hold office. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Stanley B. Greenberg is a pollster who has worked for Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Tony Blair, and Nelson Mandela. He says that even as polls failed to predict Trump's victory in 2016, believe them now when they predict his defeat. And we say hello to Stanley B. Greenberg, a leading Democratic pollster, founding partner of Greenberg Research and Democracy Corps. He's also the author, most recently, of R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stanley Greenberg, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
I am delighted to do this, particularly for America's Democrats.
Well, thank you very much, and we're delighted. We're delighted to have you with us. Now, we, of course, are talking to you at a time when presumptive Democratic candidate Joe Biden is polling remarkably well, even in states that Trump won in 2016. Yeah. But after polling failed to predict Trump's victory in 2016, there's a level of cynicism about your craft. However, you recently in The Atlantic wrote, "Believe the polls this time." To begin with, the numbers are different. How does Biden's polling now differ from Hillary Clinton's 4 years ago?
Well, they're very different. First of all, I mean, in simple terms, they're at least double, maybe even triple the margin that Hillary Clinton had, in the national polls at the time. So that's in some sense, that's the smallest piece. The other piece has to do with the underrepresentation of the white working class, the forgotten Americans. Most of the pollsters assumed the exit polls were right on the percentage college-educated voters. So we really did underrepresent working class voters. And that has been corrected in almost all the polls that I know about. And that's the biggest piece. There was a white working class revolt. To be honest, there was a working class revolt, which included a white working class revolt against the Democrats, against Hillary, in some sense Obama, we'll talk in our governance, but also we had underrepresentation of our own working class voters, our own base voters of color, who had low turnout in many elections in that period. So, let me go to one other piece that's important. There's also a revolt, against Donald Trump. The reason why the polls are so strong is the American people were in revolt against everything that Trump stood for. They dislike his America First, nativist, racist, authoritarian, worldview, and they have taken every opportunity, beginning with the Women's March, to say no, this is not what we believe, and we've seen it massive turnout with women voters electing Democratic, women, and shift across the suburban, areas in particular. And that's one piece of the revolt. On America First, the country hates the trade war, and Americans want to engage with the world, not look in. And then probably most important, immigration. This is a pro-immigration country. It's become more pro-immigration. So they were in revolt against his vision way before the polls turned against him for Biden.
Well, and you wrote also in The Atlantic recently about the revulsion for Donald Trump. What tells you this revulsion goes beyond the traditional Democratic base in a way that could hurt him in November?
Well, when you have 67% of the American people, liking Black Lives Matter, let's just start from there and then work backward. I mean, the country is upset about what's happened on racial injustice, on inequality, both racial and the broader inequality in the country, and they are just dead set against his vision of the country, and everything we've seen, in the way he's handled the protests, against him, what he's done with criminal justice, everything we're watching, is voters are voting against him, and there's been no fallback. There's just been a steady, increasing disagreement with the fundamental core things that Trump is battling for.
It's quite the different moment for the Republican Party, and you describe in the book R.I.P. GOP. It's a party at war with itself. How do you see that playing out today?
Yeah, it's deeper than that, and so like one of the things that I most focused on is Democrats can't be cautious. I think we're dealing with a once in a century kind of implosion of a party, of a national party, that is going to have wreckage afterwards, that we're going to be dealing with an entirely different country because of what happened. It's like when the Whigs disappeared and you had a new party system with the Republican Party dominant. I think the most important thing we're watching is the implosion of the Republican Party. That's produced by the Tea Party dominated party that Trump now leads. They took control in 2010, and they are a narrower block of the Republican Party. And they've driven out the moderates, they've driven out the college-educated voters, they've driven out the McCain conservatives, and it's a diminished party. So the party that Trump leads is a smaller party that will then have to deal with many elections to come back afterwards.
And here we are less than 3 months ahead of the election. Do you see any signs that Republicans are willing to do what would be necessary to build a unified party?
He can't do it. Look, Trump, Trump was there because he won the Tea Party base of the party. That's where he built. If you look at the primary results, in 2016, he came down the escalator. He ran as an anti-immigration candidate, attacked Mexican Americans. That was his main focus of his announcement speech. And electorally, he created a Tea Party base, which was the most anti-immigrant, most pro-gun, most anti-immigrant part of the party. Then he built a coalition with evangelicals, which he used Pence for. But we have to understand how insecure his hold on the Republican Party. None of the candidates who ran with him endorsed him at the time of his convention. None of the prior Republican presidential candidates and presidents came to his convention. He had barely half his party. And he punished people who opposed him, but he was like a 45%. And so his only strategy was to consolidate and govern for that base of evangelicals and Tea Party. But the consequences, he's driven out everybody else. He's too insecure. I mean, and if we watch him, demanding that people, liberate, Detroit, what? He has a pop gun. This is a guy, look at his rally in Tulsa. He can't get people to come to a rally. He can't get people to come, save him at the White House. It was a very insecure candidate, president, and he just does not have the ability, and he was never willing to do it. He created a government that was a Tea Party government, destroy every agency that that we work for. It just cannot, and he could not have had a worse thing happen than this pandemic, because he had to use government, but he was destroying government.
Right. Yeah. We're speaking with Stanley Greenberg, leading Democratic pollster, founding partner of Greenberg Research and Democracy Corps, and also the author, most recently, of R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stanley, turning to what Democrats need to do, surely sitting back and just believing in polls is not enough. How can Democrats most effectively build on the anti-Trump sentiment?
Really, I was going to recommend that we just sit back and let the dice. Look, my biggest fear is that Democrats are too cautious, that they don't understand that this party has gone to the most extreme it can. It's survived by bringing in the most racist elements of the country. But the country will reject it in the most profound terms possible, and create a trajectory, probably something like, what Democrats had to do after our defeat with Reagan in 1980 and 1984. It took us 3 or 4 elections before we had a Bill Clinton who had a different coalition and was able to then win the country's confidence. I think we're in a situation where you cannot be an anti-immigrant party. That's their main identity now. If you look at the strongest correlate with Republican, it's being anti-immigration. This is a pro-immigrant, diverse country, young, millennial, Gen Z, increasingly, all of which accept the diversity of the country. And this party is so alienated from the country. And so my fear is that we don't go all the way to Texas and battle for every Senate seat. Look what happened, when we had this, the Senate race against Cruz, when you had a competitive, Senate race, and look what happened at state, in state elections. Everything in Texas is up in 2020. Every office, and it's not that many seats to get control of one part of the legislature, and reapportionment no longer being dominated by Republicans. It's there's so much at stake with the making sure we understand this. This Trump is not happening again. He's not going to win. He has so much less of a chance of winning now, given the trends of the country, the revolt against him. And the polls reflect it, and so what they should produce I believe, is being much more aggressive in going for as big a possible electoral landslide that's there. And look at everything I see, I see Biden being pretty aggressive, both on what he's coming out for and where he's advertising and what he's thinking about.
Well, and as you well know, it's rarely enough to be against something in politics. You have to be for something. What are you hearing from voters about what they want from their next president and Congress? And is it something that Democrats can deliver?
Well, I think they can. And I think the country has seen nothing but a Tea Party dominated gridlock over the last decade, since the 2010 election. I think that was produced, by a Republican Party that was determined to stop the first Black president and his coalition from governing. And the country has not seen a party that is really dominant and has the ability to pass legislation and act on a vision for the country. And they're going to come into the election with obviously health and economic crisis and a crisis in racial justice, but with the ability to act on it. And I think we're looking at a once in a century moment where the country is looking for the Democrats to act. But it's also a country that is I think is now much more alert to the inequality that emerged in the pandemic, and the country's the racial and economic inequalities that are so vivid. But you also watch a president that they think governs for himself, for the billionaires and the richest donors, and they think they're in it for the greed and everything we're watching. If we look at what they're doing in the kind of recovery package, can you believe the Democrats have on the table, whether we're going to have $600 a week in unemployment insurance? Republicans have on the table full deductibility of business lunches. What country? What are we doing here? believes the reason for this unemployment is that people are laggards, that the reason they're unemployed, is because how high the unemployment benefits are. Who are these people? They're governing for the rich. They're governing for the biggest corporations. They are out for themselves, and we've already seen how much corruption there is.
I have to stop you there, Stanley. You were at the tail end of that. You were dropping out a little bit on that response, and it was when you were doing the part about talking about what's in the latest bill and how the Democrats want to. Do you think you could pick up from there and then go on?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Look at the contrast on the differences between Democrats and Republicans on what's in the recovery package. What will be the next part of the package? Democrats want $600 a week of unemployment compensation. The Republicans are battling for full deductibility of business lunches, and they want to reduce it to $200. They really do believe that the reason why people are unemployed is because they get food stamps and unemployment benefits, as opposed to a crashing economy. So they're so out of touch and cruel that I think you're gonna see a Democratic Party and a country that will rally to a vision of let's make this government work for everyone, the middle class, the vulnerable, and let's push out this greed and corruption that's making this government only work for the richest corporation and the biggest donors. And I think the country's ready to rally to that.
Now, going back to 2016, one of the lessons we've heard is that Clinton did not speak to the so-called forgotten American. In other words, and you touched on this at the top of the program, the white working class voter. How do Democrats speak directly to this constituency while at the same time folding them into a vision of an inclusive America?
Okay, look, I'm glad you focused on it, because I do think it's the essence of it. And it's actually in part why I think not just why Hillary lost, but because why they had such a bad Tea Party decade, is they did not see how damaged working people were by the financial crisis, the lost wealth, lost income, and it took the whole Obama presidency to get back even to where they were before. So since the working people were kind of invisible to them, they didn't see how much they were hurt by by our own governance. They didn't get their wealth or income back under Democrats. And so, one of the biggest worries, and I'm not worried, Joe Biden is not going to say the Trump voters are deplorable. He's not going to say that. In his bones, he's battling for the middle class. That's who he's for. That's where he's campaigning, the extent to which you can campaign. But Hillary Clinton, very consciously got, hurt very much in Michigan, losing Macomb County and a lot of the white working class voters that Democrats had won back by Bill Clinton and Obama. And she decided not to campaign there, and she was not visible, winning their votes or in the rural areas. And these voters want, and rightly want, respect. But I believe Joe Biden, wakes up every morning without having to think about it and says, I respect the forgotten Americans. That's what I'll govern for. And I think they believe that.
Okay. Stanley Greenberg, leading Democratic pollster, founding partner of Greenberg Research and Democracy Corps, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. His latest book, R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stanley, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back and talk again soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why Democrats need a broad coalition that includes the white working class and how to build it. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
As progressive champion John Lewis warned, your right to vote is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You see, it's one thing to have the right to cast your ballot, but it's quite another thing to be able to exercise that right. During the past decade, Republican officials and operatives have become experts at voter suppression, using legal technicalities, poll closures, fraud, fear-mongering, and plain old thuggish intimidation to shut out voters who are inclined to support Democratic candidates. Rather than winning votes, their game is preventing votes. And now comes Donald Trump with a pernicious scheme to keep millions of us from having our say in November's election. Here's the story. Because of the spreading COVID-19 health crisis, a majority of Americans are reluctant to risk their lives by voting in crowded polling places. Shouldn't be a problem, though. Just let everyone who's concerned use our nation's excellent, reliable, trusted postal service to cast their votes by mail. But such a sensible solution panicked Trump. Eek, he shrieked. Mail-in voting will increase turnout, and that's bad for me. Yet, he can't just ban voters from using the mail, so he came up with a maniacal Plan B. Simply defund the U.S. Postal Service so it can't do its job, thus forcing everyone to vote in person or give up their voting rights. Sure enough, in March he personally killed a bipartisan provision in the National Economic Rescue Package that would have assured timely delivery of our mail. Then in May, he installed one of his partisan mega-donors as Postmaster General, and he is now sabotaging delivery times by arbitrarily slashing the hours of postal workers. This is Jim Hightower saying, to help save our public post office and our right to vote from this tin-hatted third world potentate, go to usmailnotforsale.org.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Ruy Teixeira specializes in the study of demographic change and its impact on elections. He says that even with demography on their side, Democrats still need to reach out beyond the ranks of its most supportive groups. And we say hello to Ruy Teixeira, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and the co-author with John Judas of The Emerging Democratic Majority. His most recent book is The Optimistic Leftist, Why the 21st Century Will Be Better Than You Think. Ruy Teixeira, thank you for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Delighted to be here.
Nice to have you back with us. I love the title of the most recent book because it's really hard to be optimistic lately, but we'll talk more about that later. You recently posted a piece that has been widely shared across the internet titled Demography is Not Destiny. In that piece, you identify how the book you wrote in 2002 with John Judas, The Emerging Democratic Majority, has been misinterpreted at the expense of Democratic Party politics. First of all, describe the central thesis of that book.
Okay, when John Judas and I wrote the book, we published it in 2002, shortly before actually the 2002 elections. We were arguing that looking at the way the demography of the country was changing, the way the economics of the country was changing, the way the sort of social and ideological changes we saw, it seemed like they were all coming together to form the basis for a Democratic majority that could be quite strong. And some of those changes, came out of the demographics basket, right? There was an increasing number of non-whites, especially the growth of Latino and Asian population. We had the professional class basically moving toward the Democrats. We had dynamic metropolitan areas we called ideopolises moving toward the Democrats. We had women becoming increasingly liberal, particularly those with a lot of education or were unmarried. So we saw these younger generations coming along who kind of crystallized a lot of these different changes. And it's not hard to look at that and say that provides a basis for something. But what we were always careful to argue in the book, and this is really the part that got lost, is that this provides the basis for a majority coalition if and only if you can join those growing constituencies with a good chunk of what were the traditional Democratic constituencies, which you might, sort of radically simplify as the white working class. The white non-college population was clearly moving against the Democrats, but you needed to retain a solid core of support among those voters, or else, all the positive changes that were happening in a demographic sense could easily be canceled out. So we argued that, we're talking about a coalition here. We're talking about bringing people together in a big tent that's going to be swelled by these rising constituencies, but they're not the only people in the tent.
How is it that the book became misunderstood?
Well, I think that's something I've ruminated on, and I think that it largely has to do with there are some tendencies of human nature, like people prefer simple to complicated arguments. They have sort of confirmation bias if they want to believe that the Democrats' task is as easy as waiting around for all these new people to enter the electorate and basically outnumber the Republicans, because that's a lot harder than trying to convince people your politics are correct. They'll tend to believe that. So I think those tendencies were always there in terms of how people reacted to the thesis, but I'd say it was turbocharged by Obama's victory in 2008, where it was, he was seen, and rightfully so, as a candidate of a rising America. He won a big victory. He got tremendous support from young people, from non-whites, from educated people. It seemed to be, that demographic coalition showing up to the party. And I think that convinced people that the simple bowdlerized version of our thesis might be correct. And what people lost in not looking at the data very carefully is that Obama made very significant progress among white non-college voters. He still had a big deficit, but it was much less than John Kerry's. So that was a big contribution to the victory, and that completely got lost in the discussion of that particular electoral victory.
Well, I mean, and there's the thing, too, because his whole campaign was about appealing to a broader coalition that included the white working class, as you point out. So where does that get lost? How do people not recognize it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It seems like a galaxy long ago and far away when Obama was talking about we're all one America, black and white, red and blue, poor. I mean, his whole message is about hope and bringing people together to accomplish things, to fulfill America's promise. That seems utterly quaint now in a way, but it shouldn't be, because that's a message of broad appeal throughout the country, including to some of the voters the Democrats have been losing, because they came to believe over time the Democrats had lost track of that. They were mostly elites who were concerned with, their own rising constituencies, weren't worried about them or the communities they lived in. And this produced, the basis for a backlash, which was, basically, charged up to a high degree by the fallout from the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, where a lot of these communities suffered greatly. And they They just felt like they went off the political radar. Now, why did Democrats allow them to fall off the political radar? Well, I think, again, it's a lot easier to think of politics in terms of we've got our friends. We have more friends over time. So what we need to do is just convince our friends to show up at the polls. And maybe that just means we say what we've said, but louder, and everything will be fine. And the people who don't vote for us, I mean, this is already a tendency in 2008, only got stronger with the rise of the Tea Party. And, the first part of the 2010s was that the people who don't support Democrats are basically the racists, they're xenophobes, they're people who are against everything that's progressive. And how can you possibly reach these people anyway? So it's, instead of worrying about reaching them, let's not bother. Let's just turn out our people. And the real problem is the people in the Democratic Party who argue we should try to reach, these persuadable voters who are in constituencies that don't currently seem favorable to us. Now, I think Obama understood the problems with that a lot better than a lot of other people. And you can look at his 2012 run for the presidency when he very consciously, I think, tried to strike a populist tone that would appeal to some of the, for example, those white non-college voters in the Midwest who Hillary Clinton famously lost in 2016. He did not pitch his campaign as something that wasn't, was only for his friends and not for the deplorables. And I think that helped him, win a decent victory in a second term, and with some, sort of on the heels of having presided over an economy that was still not exactly back to full health. So he did a good job with the bad situation. He was able to do it because I think he understood a little bit better what the Obama coalition really was.
Yeah, well, and so Democrats fail to focus on maintaining that broader coalition. And as I'm reading your piece, the demography is not destiny piece, and just thinking about this whole conversation, I immediately start thinking about Hillary Clinton 2016 and how that was a political failure. Are there other examples of political failure that have come, because of this lack of maintaining that broader coalition, or at least trying to?
Well, I think Hillary Clinton in her campaign is sort of exemplar of this, the poster child, as they say. But I think, part of my argument in the piece is that, the Democrats suffered wave after wave of defeats under Obama, except really for the 2012 election for president. And I think a lot of it was because, the image of the party as a party was evolving over time to the point where even in races where people weren't like Hillary Clinton, it was hurting Democrats. Democrats were viewed as a party of coastal elites, the party of non-whites, the party of, professionals who looked down on them, the party of everybody who wasn't them. And it's very difficult for people to vote for a party, even if they feel, some of what the party has to say might be in their, baseline economic interest, if they don't trust that party, if they think they're looked down at them, if they think that they don't take their problems seriously and they don't care about their communities. Now, you could argue that was not correct on the part of these white non-college voters, but that's not the point. That's not how politics works. Politics isn't adjudicated on the basis of who's got the empirically best case about their policies. It's based on how people view you as whether you're on their side or not, and whether they find your pitch appealing, and whether they look at your history of your rhetoric and what your party has been doing, and they judge it to have been on their side. So, I think Democrats did lose track of that as a party. And I think Hillary Clinton's candidacy in 2016 was, in that sense, no accident. And how she ran, she was really reflecting the center of gravity of the Democratic Party at the time, just like I think to some extent Biden represents it today. But Hillary was, why did she run as she did against Trump? Why did she think that all she had to do was point out what an awful person he was and not even run much on her own, friggin' economic platform, which actually wasn't that bad? Why did she not do what she should have done in, Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania? Why did she take them for granted? Why did she, one of the great gaffes of the 2010s was, the basket of deplorables, right? When a politician says what they really think. I think that you could argue that single gaffes usually don't matter that much. They're overrated. But, that really underscored for a lot of these voters what they didn't like about her. She's a coastal elite. She hung around with Wall Street people. She looked down on them. And, screw her, basically. So
I have felt all along that one line may have almost single-handedly sunk her. And obviously there were many more factors to it, but that one line, the deplorable line, was definitely a killer.
And she didn't know how to walk it back too. Remember, Obama got in trouble for people clinging to their guns and religion and that sort of stuff.
Right.
But he knew how to walk it back and explain. Okay, here's what I'm really talking about. Here's what I really think about the problems poor and rich, black and white have in this country. She never did that. So
yeah. We're speaking with Ruy Teixeira, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. He's co-author with John Judas of The Emerging Democratic Majority, most recent book, The Optimistic Leftist, Why the 21st Century Will Be Better Than You Think. So, Ruy, let's turn to the present moment. You suggest that Joe Biden is actually correcting course, has the potential to rebuild the broad coalition that Obama sought. How is he doing that?
Well, he's doing this, first and foremost, we can't forget the fundamentals of this election. People don't like Trump. The country's in an incredible mess. The economy is in free fall. And the main thing is that the coronavirus pandemic is completely not under control, and people blame Trump for it. His ratings on this stuff is terrible, deplorable. And, basically the protests that arose around George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, this is something that a more deft Republican politician might not have sustained that much damage from, because there was some dicey aspects to the movement that they could have played on in a law and order sense. But Trump was completely incapable of doing that. So he's tanked on that as well. So this is a great opportunity for Democrats to bring the country together against Trump for, reasonably progressive political and economic program, and sort of put back into play this idea we're all one America and we have problems to solve together and we all have a role. And, I'm going to bring the country together, not tear it apart. So Biden's a perfect candidate for that, arguably. And when people were criticizing him during the primaries because he wasn't willing to get on board with decriminalizing the border or some of the other or Medicare for all, for example, which is still very scary to a lot of people. He didn't want to ban fracking. I mean, he said and did a lot of things that clearly staked him out as a moderate relative to the rest of the field. And because he did that, because he wasn't scary, because he basically cleaved to the center of overall public opinion in the country, which just moved significantly to the left. I mean, and Biden reflects that today in his program. It's the most left program any Democrats run on in a gazillion years, right? So, but Biden stuck to that, and he didn't go, farther to the left to try to appease some of these activist constituencies who are very, sort of influential, at least in the discourse about democratic politics, the people on Twitter and so on, the more activists and advocacy organizations. His basic attitude was, how many votes do they have? I'm going to stick to what I think is the best way to do this and what would appeal to the electorate as a whole. And, if when the smoke clears and the dust settles, maybe I'll be the nominee. And you know what? He was right. These other people ran out of gas, and the normie Democrats spoke. Once it got out of the hothouse of New Hampshire and Iowa, Nevada was an interesting test case. So you could even see signs of Sanders losing altitude at that time, even though people didn't believe it. But you always knew that South Carolina was going to be the point at which normie Democrats could weigh in, and that might make a difference. And boy, did they. And then that was followed by a Super Tuesday. And it turns out that the media Democrat just doesn't endorse a lot of these more outre, boutique, left activist, endorsed, attitudes towards politics. They've got they're more pragmatic. They're progressive and pragmatic. So who did they pick? The pragmatic progressive, Joe Biden. So, and they wanted to beat Trump. I mean, what's the point of running if you couldn't beat this guy? I mean, people were obsessed with this, and for good reason. Nothing good will happen until you get that guy out of office. So, again, Biden was perfectly designed to appeal to that. And so he's put back together, now that he's running as a general election candidate, in essence, that coalition that Obama had, and maybe then some. He's brought back a lot of white non-college voters. He's doing even better among white college voters. He's still got his support is strong and solidifying among non-whites and among young voters based on the data I've been looking at. And that's why he's killing it. That's why he now has the electoral vote advantage.
Yeah, I mentioned the demography is not destiny piece that you wrote, and in there you talk about taking the path of progressive centrism will not be easy. So what are some of the potential pitfalls?
Right. Yeah. I mean, looks fairly rosy now for the Democrats. I mean, let's not count our chickens before they're hatched. But their chances of beating Trump pretty badly, taking back the Senate, probably expanding the margin in the House, making progress in the states, it's all there. But, you can be like the dog that caught the bus. What do you do when you actually take power and some of these fissures that are potentially present in the coalition manifest themselves? I mean, there is a strong left of the party that is going along with Biden now, and not necessarily because they love him, but because, well, they want to beat Trump. And that's fine. But, maybe they're not going to give up once he's in office. Maybe, they'll push him much farther left in immigration than he wants to go. Maybe Biden will, they'll sort of discover once again, they don't want to do a public option. They want Medicare for all. Maybe the Black Lives Matter movement and some of its more outre demands, like defund the police, defund and or abolish the police, will come to the fore, and Biden will get a lot of flack for not being heavy enough on that. Maybe this gets ugly, and maybe it gets ugly fast. The logical thing for Democrats to do, if they have this kind of victory, and they have this potential power, is to move as fast as possible to pass progressive legislation that can actually get the majorities they need, right? They'll probably have to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate. Let's hope they do that. But, they won't have a lot of time to waste in infighting. And if they appear to this new Biden coalition, this sort of new, this group that sort of brought that more of the traditional electorate and the rising constituents back together as a real Democratic majority, if they start losing people because they're fighting over things that people have zero interest in, basically, then I think, you're running into trouble. You're stepping on the story that you should be telling, which is that we're the party that really represents America, that can actually change things for the better. And we're doing it right now. And we're not caught up in infighting. We're not like those crazy Republicans. So I think there is danger there. I mean, we've already seen it, I think, in how some of the debates that have come in and around the protests around the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd. I mean, there's been some pretty extreme stuff with the tearing down of statues. And again, the idea we should defund or abolish the police. There's been some violence. Biden's been pretty good about separating himself from that stuff. But I don't think those kinds of activists are not going to give up.
Right.
And they definitely have sort of an audience at this point. They have connections to various Democratic electeds. They have very good coverage in the press, to say the least. And I think, this is the sort of stuff that could blow up. But I'm hopeful not, because I think in the end, people want to get stuff done, and hopefully that'll trump everything else, if you excuse the term.
Yes, we will. We will this time. Now, of course, you do argue that Joe Biden has chosen a difficult path, but at the same time, you are optimistic that it can work. What makes you optimistic?
Well, I think, for the very simple reason that the problems that we have, that have to be dealt with are vast and will require quick action. He has the coalition that should enable him to do it. And I'm just assuming pragmatism in that sense will carry the day. It's non-trivial to be able to get this kind of coalition together after the way the Democrats have arguably mishandled things for the last 12 years. So my assumption is parties like to do stuff. They like to be successful. And once they're in a position to be successful, they're much more likely, they're somewhat likely to pursue it. provided that crazy stuff doesn't happen. So, what's the most probable outcome here? I think the most probable outcome is Democrats, if they do have a really good victory in 2020, will move ahead with doing stuff that will actually put the country on a significantly different course. If you do that, and you retain a good chunk of your political support from those more difficult constituencies, and you actually improve their lives, you actually get yourself in a position where we can break the dysfunctional cycle of populist surge and decline, rotating parties in office, and you can actually have a decade where you get things done. I mean, call it the progressive 2020s. I think the stage is set for that. And part of my reason I write the articles I do and make some of the arguments I do is, don't blow it. That's my advice. Don't blow it. But I'm optimistic that the possibility and the strong possibility is there.
And so maybe we may now finally see that emerging Democratic majority that you and John Judas wrote about back in 2002.
In the proper sense, yes.
Absolutely. Ruy Teixeira, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. The emerging Democratic majority that he wrote with John Judas, of course, you can check out. And of his most recent, The Optimistic Leftist, Why the 21st Century Will Be Better Than You Think. Ruy, as always, we appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back and do it again soon.
No, absolutely. It's great fun.
Thanks very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with leading psychiatrists about why they are putting their careers on the line to warn us about Trump's mental state.
Public health professionals, certainly most mental health professionals, did not get involved in the political debate at all, mostly sat on the sidelines, either by choice or perhaps under pressure not to get involved. And yet, some of you took a different path. In 2017, under the leadership of Dr. Lee, 27 of you got together, published a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. And there was a second edition of that, of course, published just last year. My question is, what did you see back then that concerned you, and what compelled you to basically break tradition and speak out? Dr. Lee, you want to start us off?
I believe that it was a historic event for us because in the past, there really wasn't much reason to speak up about a public figure. And it's actually untrue that people hadn't spoken up. In fact, many were speaking in various ways about public figures, but there wasn't such urgency as when Donald Trump started to appear and became a presidential candidate and then subsequently was elected. That was when we witnessed a somewhat historic event in that more and more mental health professionals were speaking up, and there was a consensus that was forming. So by the time that we held the ethics conference at Yale in April 2017, it was to discuss how we should speak about the president, whether or not we should come together in a collective voice and try to inform the public of what we saw were the president's rather severe psychological dangers and how to do so. And it came out as a consensus from the meeting that we indeed had an ethical obligation to warn and inform the public about what we saw.
I think part of our concern was that he was very successful at presenting himself as something that he wasn't, and we could recognize the inherent danger in people sort of swallowing that presentation and investing him with power when he was someone with a long track record of impulsivity and poorly considered decisions and vengefulness and disregard of the truth. And those things were obvious to us as mental health professionals, and they seem to have escaped the notice of large segments of the population, sufficient for him to get elected or just not be weighed as heavily as we felt they should be, given the inherent danger of having someone so incapable of reflective thought and collaboration holding the instruments of great power.
Looking back, do you wish you had spoken out earlier, maybe before the election rather than after?
Many of us had in sporadic ways, but it only became more organized upon the urgency of the election. I myself had decided to change course from trying to speak more privately and go through the official channels of speaking to lawmakers, for example. After the election, when members of the public got in touch with me, I received a deluge of emails and phone calls the morning after election. So that's how I decided to become public about it. But certainly there might have been others who thought of doing so earlier.
And Dr. Glass, I guess part of the reality is that most people didn't think there was any chance Donald Trump was going to get elected.
Well, that was certainly an opinion that I shared and many others. We were talking amongst ourselves, but after his election, we were struck with the urgency of the predicament that we faced as a country, and the discussions among ourselves felt insufficient. So a group of us wrote a letter that was published in the New York Times pointing out the unfitness of Donald Trump to hold this office, after which we got the predictable criticism and accusations from our own professional association, the American Psychiatric Association, whose Goldwater rule, in truth, had sort of inhibited us from going there because it was an ethical violation to speak out about someone who you hadn't examined and whose authorization you hadn't received.
Do you believe that you were in violation of the Goldwater rule by publishing this book? And Dr. Glass, maybe before Dr. Lee jumps in, you could just explain to all of our listeners who may not understand or remember what the Goldwater rule was all about.
Well, the Goldwater rule arose after a kind of black eye was gotten by the psychiatric profession when people went after Barry Goldwater with an assortment of diagnoses, never having examined him, and then having their opinions aggregated in Fact magazine, who was sued successfully by Barry Goldwater. And the professional discipline of psychiatry didn't want that sort of thing to diminish the credibility of the profession. So it came out with what became colloquially known as the Goldwater rule, which was a prohibition against giving diagnoses to people that you hadn't examined. And it was nicknamed as the no diagnosis from afar rule. And so we all lived with that and hadn't felt really pushed to go beyond that, and took our place among the other professions, watching things play out on the national scene until Donald Trump made his descent, the golden staircase, and came to occupy the seat of the greatest power in this country. And then our alarm bells went off and overcame our reluctance to place ourselves in possible ethical violation by speaking out about someone we hadn't examined.
But Dr. Lee, doesn't the Goldwater rule itself, even in its original form, make an exception for, I'm paraphrasing here, extreme public danger?
Absolutely. All medical ethics, in fact, the ethical code itself, states that these are not rules, they are principles. And therefore, they have to be weighed against the greater goals of medicine, which is to save lives and to better health and well-being of patients and society. And people often forget that physicians have responsibility to patients as well as society, almost in equal terms. And I do not feel we broke the Goldwater Rule, because the Goldwater Rule itself falls under the principle that we improve the community and better public health. The very purpose of its being placed in ethics is not so as to protect a public figure, which we have no responsibility toward, one who is not a patient in any case, but our responsibility is to society. And so we do not diagnose public figures, do not give out frivolous conclusions without having examined them and properly examined them in detail, because it would hurt society in many conceivable instances. But if not speaking about the public figure poses a harm to society, and we at the ethics conference gave extreme danger as our standard for speaking up so vocally. But in fact, the way the rules are written, any benefit to public health should allow for psychiatrists to speak up.
We do respect the rights of individuals to privacy, but as Bandy pointed out, Donald Trump is not our patient. He is a public figure, and there is enormous evidence from his own mouth about his reactions to people. There's the testimony under oath of people who have worked with him. There's no shortage of evidence to allow one to draw a conclusion about fitness. Fitness is not the same thing as diagnosis. If Donald Trump was behaving in this sort of irresponsible way, and all he were doing was buying and selling apartments in New York City, we would have no need and no inclination to speak up about his mental fitness. But when we see him in a position of enormous power and discretion, with all of the liabilities that such that he could never pass any employer's test for judgment and temperance and collaboration and respect for and ability to work with other people, and saw him virtually unchecked, it was, as Dr. Lee points out, a compelling responsibility to not be inhibited by the constraints that appropriately apply to patients when this man was not a patient. He was a public figure with the capacity to do great harm.
And in fact, Dr. Lee, one of my takeaways from your book was that collectively your concern, and several of you make this point in different ways, that your concern was not the mental health of Donald Trump, it was the public danger that he represented in the office of president.
Yes, because Mr. Trump, if he were not in the office of the presidency, would not be such a great danger. In fact, dangerousness, just like fitness, and someone who is dangerous would be automatically unfit, has nothing to do with diagnosis. It has little to do with diagnosing a mental illness, because very few mental illnesses are connected to dangerousness. And so it's a separate evaluation that's more about the situation, not so much about the person, but rather the weapons they have access to, the authority they have, and the influence they have. And therefore, it's an evaluation that could be made in real time, in fact, should be made based on real reactions to real situations. And so in this case, you don't need the intimate medical records or a personal interview. In fact, a personal interview is often discouraged because the person can falsely report or lead you astray.
Yes, that's so important. We have tried as much as possible in all of our pieces to make it clear that we are not diagnosing, we are not focused on the issue of mental illness, because some of our greatest leaders, like Abraham Lincoln or Winston Churchill, had mental illnesses, and they were the greatest leaders that we can point to. So our concern is about fitness, his capacity to do the job in a safe, considered, and responsible fashion. And that is something that seems often to be lost when we are tarred with the broad brush of oh, you're diagnosing somebody that you've never met. No, we aren't diagnosing him. We're commenting on his mental fitness to carry out the responsibilities of his office.
Given that, did you make any effort to go to the American Psychiatric Association and say, now let's update this Goldwater rule, or let's fit it to our times, or maybe amend it in any way?
Well, we did. After the publication of the book and the broad condemnation of it by the psychiatric establishment, we formed a committee of the authors, and we came up with what were thoughtful and considered revisions that could be applied to the Goldwater rule that would save the important protective elements and also provide room for members to express their conscience and respond to the needs of the public. We worked on it for months, and we had two of our most senior leaders, Robert J. Lifton and Judy Herman, who were distinguished life fellows of the American Psychiatric Association, present our recommendations to them so we could enter into a negotiation and update it, as you suggested. And they have never responded to us.
Never responded, Dr. Lee? I mean, this is a pretty important group of people coming to them with their best ideas.
Not only that, this committee, which Len headed, was hardworking and came up with a very thoughtful revision that preserved the essence of the Goldwater rule, the parts that we could all agree on, but also allowed for exceptions, just like any other rule. And there should not have been a more reasonable attempt at reconciliation. But apart from Len's activities, I also wrote a letter along with Robert J. Lifton and Judith Herman to the APA, and that they did respond to. We were asking for a discussion, just a discussion to review some of the ideas, whether some need reconsideration. And they wrote back stating that the discussion was over, that they had already done a discussion. But this was under the conditions of numerous protest letters being sent to the ethics committee, members demanding a vote that the membership was never consulted. And there was an American College of Psychiatrists meeting where it was revealed that an overwhelming majority of psychiatrists disagreed with the Goldwater rule in its current state. And also there was, in fact, another foremost Goldwater rule scholar who offered to a new president-elect of the APA, offering to chair a commission to re-examine the Goldwater rule. And the president-elect was very excited. But once she was put in place in her presidency of the APA, she was somehow barred from ever responding back to him.
Bill Press with contributors to the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Stanley Greenberg, Ruy Teixeira, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.